Carlton King is a former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in a jihadi organisation.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe for free.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy Podcast, the show that shines a light on the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations, but actually majors in the world of geopolitics. And last week's programme was all about the geopolitics of where we are in the world today. It's one of my critical thinking episodes, or episodes too now, and the reason why is because I'm worried that we're at a very dangerous stage in the world. So last week what I did is I went through where we were and I brought us up to date with the war in the Ukraine. I spoke about the actions taken against China. I spoke about the monetary systems and how the United States is losing out now monetarily because the dollar is actually under massive threat, no longer being perceived as the, if you will, the world currency. So the reserve currency aspect of the US, which allowed the United States to print trillions of dollars and be trillions of dollars in debt, is now questionable because the reserve status of the United States dollar may now be under threat because of the way the United States carried out actions against Russia when Russia went into the Ukraine. And I explained all of that in last week's episode. So if you haven't listened to last week's episode, go back, listen to it, and you'll see why the dollar is now in a precarious situation. And you'll see why China and how China and the war in the Ukraine and Russia, why that is now coming to the fore. Okay, so let's continue. We're still talking about the situation in the Ukraine for now, and then I'll jump across to Israel and Palestine, because the reality is it's all part of the same panoply of problems for the United States and the United States way forward in the secret wars that we're now involved in. Because there's the open conflict that you can see in front of you, and then there's a secret war that's going on around the world by the United States, spearheaded obviously by the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency of the United States. And of course, allies like us in the Secret Intelligence Service, better known as MI6 in the United Kingdom, and other Western agencies such as, I would suggest to you, the French agencies, and the German agencies, Bundesnachrichtendienst example, that these agencies are also involved. Japanese will be involved. All of the agencies involved, because the world now is in flux. So this is the problem. The secret war is big and massive and working through. Now, why do I mention this? Because, as I said last week, what we've now got is we have an optimum perspective from Russia at one stage of let's get into Ukraine, let's stop Ukraine being part of NATO so we cannot be bullied as they would perceive it, and we are not at threat and the weapons are not there to undermine us. Let's work with what we have on hand to make sure that as a country we can still be viable. Then, mistake made by the United States in the SWIFT system, preventing that to Russia. Mistake made by the United States Treasury again in basically saying we're going to freeze your monies in our bank. When they say your monies, US dollars owned by Russia in our banks. We're going to start taking personal monies from individuals, impounding boats, etc., etc., etc. And nothing gets the powerful going by other powerful people saying to them, look what they've done, right? So these are all issues that matter. You're hitting the 1%. It matters, yeah? You think you're going one way, actually you're pushing it in a different direction. So this is what's gone on. Add to that, I would suggest, which we didn't speak about last week, but we're going to speak about now, is about what this meant for Russia as the war went on. Because initially, I think Russia thought those sanctions would harm it massively. I think it thought, we're done, we're over. What I think they didn't understand is other nations felt the threat of the United States. So, of course, first and foremost amongst them, because the United States was trying to do the same at the other end of the Pacific, is China. And China must have thought to itself, you know what? Let us aid Russia in any way we can. Economically. Don't want to be involved militarily because that's not China's way, but economically. So I think it's done that. So we can, where you sold your goods previously to the West, sell it now to us and we'll sell our goods to you because China's all about money. So let's sell our goods to you. So that's where it goes. We will accept your ruble. It's money. It works, but better if you can exchange for gold, etc., which Russia has. Or maybe oil, which you've got an abundance of. And then, of course, you get the Indians come in. And they say, listen, you put your oil towards us, yeah, and we'll sell it on. Not a problem. So masses of oil go from Russia to India, and that oil then is cleaned from being Russian oil to Indian oil, right? So these are the sort of things that the United States wasn't thinking about. And the European Union, which jumped wholesale behind the United States. And I think that's directed very much by the individual that sits at the head of the European Union. I think there is a question there that needs to be answered, and I'll just leave it at that. But she's gone wholesale behind the United States and gone anti-Russian on that side. Remember, she came from the German military where she was defense secretary. There may well be some connection there that has led her to be a great supporter of the United States. I'll say no more than that. So what we look at then with this is that India then gets involved, but it plays both sides. But the bottom line is it increases its power because it then gets great deal on oil, a fantastic deal on oil. Add to that, you've got to remember that the United States clearly blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. Now, if you're Germany, what do? A pipeline which gives you cheap oil and cheap gas, which allows you to be the industrial heartland of Europe and indeed beyond, is now destroyed, and your industry all of a sudden then is struggling. It may be a bit strong when they say it's deindustrialized Germany, but it definitely has played a negative impact on German industry. Okay? People understand this. And the problem is that the politician now is going one way, totally and utterly backing the United States, but the people are turning around, and the media said, it's got to be the Russians. Right? Now, what the biggest stupid statement ever. It must be the Russians blowing up their own $1 trillion pipeline that's sending gas, which is keeping them alive because of the monies that the foreign currencies they're getting. That's bringing them wealth, and they're going to blow it up. Why? Because there is a support for the Ukraine from Germany, not taking into account that the President of the United States said gas will not flow and oil will not flow through that pipeline. And when asked by a German reporter, well, how do you know that? And the president turned around, Biden, and said, we have our ways. But believe me, gas will not go through that pipeline. A month later, it's blown up. Right? So they're asking the people to be aware of that, to have heard that from a German reporter, to have heard that, speaking to the President of the United States, to have the arch individual who is probably the technocrat behind this process, and I'm saying technocrat, I mean it more as an apparatchik in charge of orientating the battle against Russia, Victoria Nuland, when you hear her laughing saying, told you it would happen. So when all that evidence is there, they ask the German people not to believe it somehow and say that the Russians have done it. When all Russia needed to do was just turn off the pipeline, right? If you wanted not to give oil to Germany. But it's not giving oil, it's keeping a lifeline for them. So you see, that's what's happened. What the United States has done with one fell swoop, though, is it's made sure that Germany stays within the orbit of the United States, does not unify in any way, shape or means with Russia. And then, on top of that, even worse, it then makes sure that Germany has to buy extremely expensive LPG from America. And that all the countries that would have got from the Germans this Russian gas, which, by the way, the Germans didn't use it all themselves. They used to pump it out to the rest of Europe, right? And the Germans made the profit on that. That's how Germany's economy was running so good. So these countries now have to buy from the US at twice the cost. So thereby undermining their economic capacity, okay? So this is how the economic game has been played. Win-win, supposedly. Win-win, we blow the pipeline, not win-win. But what they don't understand is that, yes, the United States can control the UN to some extent because it's got two other colleagues, United Kingdom and France, that sit there, and they can stop by vetoing any issue that comes forward. However, when the Russians are also permanent members and they stand up, and the Chinese are supporting the Russians, and they stand up and say, put an investigation into who blew up Nord Stream. Which perpetrator of an offence turns around and says, I want you to investigate the offence and provide me with all the information so the whole world can see who's guilty? Does a guilty person do that? No, they don't. You know they don't. If their hands on it, they never do it. So then we get Sweden and Denmark looking at this issue, and then all of a sudden, there's secrets stamped on both of them. Oh, we've got some understanding, but we won't say because it's not in our international interest to explain who blew up Nord Stream. What does that say to you? That doesn't say it's Russia, because they're complaining about Russia all day long. They're saying all day long Russia's done this, that and the other, and Russia's bad, blah, blah, blah. So if it were Russia that did it, they would have been up straight away and said, Russia did it, this is the evidence. But no, they don't say that, do they? They say the exact opposite. They say it's not in our interest to explain who has carried out these actions. Then you get Cy Hirsch, who's the great reporter from the United States, the fella who first told about the My Lai massacre in Vietnam in 1968, so therefore has great Pulitzer Prize winner, has a great background. And he says, I have information that says the United States blew it up. So he's rubbished, because he's got to be now. He's got to be rubbished to say it. Okay, so he's put down on a way. But his message comes out. Now, the fact is, it doesn't really come out in the mass media because the mass media is taken control of. It's not a problem. The mass media can run with what it runs. But some of it does seep into CNN and seeps into other places where people in the end, because it's being carried by shows like mine and other shows, people in the end have to say, we've got to answer this question. Why is Hirsch saying this happened? Why is he quoting CIA individuals and special forces individuals saying this happened? Right? So now you've got a problem. So then, I guess the backup was already in place. They then say, Ukrainians did it. We didn't want them to do it, but the Ukrainians did it. Knowing fair well that the capacity to do that sits in the hands of actually quite very few nations. Maybe the United States, I would suggest the United Kingdom probably has that capacity. And a few others potentially have that capacity. Whether a few others, but definitely the US, and I would suggest definitely the United Kingdom has that capacity to blow that up. Right? So then you have a problem. So these are shenanigans that have gone on. But this is where it gets bad. Because as the war goes on then in the Ukraine, and as situations fall away and more of these hurdles that would have not gone forward start to be being dropped, where NATO all of a sudden, read for that, not the whole of NATO, but various elements within NATO, France, obviously the United States, France, United Kingdom, etc., start using the capacity to aid the deaths of Russian soldiers, it's a war after all, and their deaths, so be it, that's the way it is, you cannot expect for Russia to say, we will forget this, we'll have some sort of amnesia. My fear is, somewhere along the line, Russia will turn around and say, there will be payback. Now that payback may not be open and may not be known. You know, I've questioned some of the other issues that went on previously with other things that Russia has meant to be done in the United Kingdom. I question the reality of those. But what I would say is, I don't think they'll be open in the reactionary actions to, and I'm calling it reactionary, but really it's just a reaction. You can't really say reactionary. You know, you bumped off some of our people, we're going to come back at you. Now, just the same way as the American did in Vietnam War. You know, when the Americans saw, example, that Cambodia was allowing, whether it could stop it or not was questionable, but the North Vietnamese armies to go through its tent, it started blowing up half of Cambodia, which led then to the Khmer Rouge and led to the killing fields. So, you know, nations do this in wars. Nations bring in other countries and destroy them and teach them a lesson for allowing other people to utilise aspects that cause them injury. So, this is where we then come to the terrorism, and you can only call it terrorism, that has happened in Russia recently. And if the shenanigans are as they are perceived, and Russia's taking very, very, very strong look at this, then I think there is only problems that can come from that. And if we've been involved, the United Kingdom, I think it's a very bad move from our Prime Minister to have allowed our secret organs of state to have been involved in carrying out actions against Russia proper. You can get away with carrying out actions in the Ukraine, but carrying out actions against Russia proper, I think, is a step too far. So I hope to God we are not dragged into that process. I fear maybe. But anyway, I hope that. That's all I'll go with that, with that area. You know, I hope we're not paying a price for following when indeed what we should be saying is stopping this carnage. Because, I mention this, because the reality is that now, up to this date now, 3 Ukrainian armies have had to be rebuilt. In other words, the losses are in the 3, 4, 500,000 of soldiers. And from what I'm seeing, and from people that I think are good individuals in terms of looking at analysis and assessment, they're telling me that Russians have probably lost in the sphere of 50,000, and then obviously they're injured. I'm talking dead Ukrainians, when I give those figures previously. When you want to add up, because the Polish general said it very recently, he said there's over 1 million Ukrainians casualties. 1.5 million indeed was what he actually said. Right? So he's obviously counting injured as well as dead. Right? So the reality is, he was saying, as was the Hungarian president forever and a day, Prime Minister forever and a day, he was saying there is no way Ukraine can win this war. Now the Poles are beginning to argue this same thing. Poland, who dragged Ukrainians in. Because what I said on that, and I'd mentioned it last week, when I said on the first show I did looking at this war in the Ukraine, I said it's all okay until people start seeing the dead and then start saying, what are we getting out of it? Not what is President Zelensky and his individuals getting out of it, the individuals who are taking money across that Polish border, but what are we, the people of the Ukraine, getting out of this, particularly the people of the Western Ukraine getting out of this. People of the Eastern Ukraine, Russian speakers, by the way, Zelensky's a Russian speaker who only recently learnt Ukrainian, but the people of Western Ukraine, what are they getting out of it? Yeah? The Eastern Ukrainians could argue, well, we've been at war with these people, they've been killing us since 2016, so we can see how, you know, Russia has aided us, and that's why we want to be part of Russia. So you can see what they're getting out of it. And Russia is smart enough to rebuild those areas and is already doing it. But the question is, what is the Western Ukraine going to get out of it? Who's going to rebuild it? And this is where we come in again. Because it's now understood that places like BlackRock, and this is what the president of Poland said recently. He said, you are saying allow the grain from Ukrainian fields to come into Poland and thereafter the rest of Europe to pay to allow the Ukrainians to get forces to carry on. Now, first and foremost, there are no men. So they're now talking about recruiting women more and more. But secondly, when I say there are no men, obviously many of the men have left the country. And indeed, they're asking, the Ukrainians that is, are asking countries like Germany, Poland, where most of the Ukrainian people of age who have run to, they're saying to them, send them back to us. Send them back. They're taking Ukrainian men off the street, 16, 17, 18, 19, up to I believe 45, taking them off the street, putting them in the back of vans and sending them to the front. And if you're able to pay, you can then get away from this. But if you can't pay, you're on the front line fighting. Okay? But that's not the big thing. The big thing is that this grain coming in to Poland is undermining Polish farmers. So just today, they're blockading all routes into Ukraine from Poland. But the point is this. These fields that this grain is being, nurtured in, and everybody knows the Ukraine has got superb black soil. This has been bought up by American companies, BlackRock, etc. They've bought up this land, Monsanto. They've bought this land up. So now it's no longer owned by Ukraine. It's owned by Americans and some others. So in other words, the Ukraine hasn't only lost its people and has been deluded of people from 40 million down to 20 or 18 or whatever it is now. And I'm not saying they've all died, they've just left and gone and they're never coming back. The question is, will people force them back from other countries? And if they do force them back, when they go back home to the Ukraine, because they were all looked after in Britain, as you know. You got a house somewhere to live. You could live with a family. You could get a job straight away. Whereas other refugees, you can't get a job. There was no question of you coming to Britain. It was easy. It was accepted. Except I'm just taking Britain as an example, but you could do this for the United States or for Germany or wherever. You automatically got that. All of that you don't get as a normal refugee. And I don't care what war you're running from, you don't get it. But as a Ukrainian, you could get all that. Your children come automatically into school. You automatically get the healthcare, etc., as a Ukrainian. Now, what's happening is a lot of people are saying, that's not right. From a lot of countries. And the politicians who've allowed that to happen are now being burnt. So you will hear them not even speaking about Ukrainian refugees anymore in the United Kingdom. Because he's made such a shout and a holler about refugees, people turn around and say, well, hang on, what about these Ukrainian guys? They've got a house. I've been on the list forever and a day. They've got straight in with some other geezer. They've got them into the schools. They're able to work straight away. When this other guy has been waiting for 10 years to work. He's not allowed to work. See, generally they don't tell the people what refugees are allowed to do, because that's the way around it. But when people learn that's what it is, then people get angry. And this is what's happened in Germany. There have been demonstrations. And in Poland and in Hungary, etc., there are demonstrations. And they're saying, this is what's happening. It's not right. So what might happen come the end of the war, finally, is some countries may turn around and say, now it's time to go home, Ukrainians. But what are they going home to? Then you've got a problem in Western Ukraine, haven't you? Putin does not want to hold that problem. Last thing he wants is to have to control Western Ukraine. He'll leave that to the West. West, you've created that problem. You've created them dying. You can have the problem in the West. All we want there is that people are happy with the East. But I fear that may jump a little bit further forward, and he may take some of the bigger areas all the way to the Dnieper River, because he's lost people and he's got to show something for the loss of people. I keep saying it's not just Putin. It's the machinery in the Kremlin, but he is the top man, and I think he has been very measured. I think there are other Russians who wouldn't be nowhere near as measured in terms of their activities, and that's where the problem lies. Because where we are going now is, especially when you get terrorism within Russia, now we're looking at some people saying, well, let's give them back what they've done to us. That then becomes problematic. Where does that end? What tactical weapons are used in that moment? You get the problem whereby, example, you have Macron saying, we should send French soldiers. Now, just yesterday, X amount of legionnaires who've been sheep-dipped, i.e. that means they are still legionnaires, but they're pretending to be basically mercenaries fighting on the behalf of the Ukrainians, but they were working with weaponry that was tactical weaponry that, frankly, you needed capable people to run. And this is what we've been doing. The United Kingdom has sent people over to run tactical weaponry that the Ukrainians probably can't work. And I'm seeing exactly the same with Americans working tactical weaponry that others can't work. Now, all of a sudden, in the past that wasn't happening, but now they are being targeted by the Russians. So as I said, just the other day, 40 were killed. Yesterday, day before, 40 were killed who happened to be French legionnaires. If Macron spoke about, we'll bring in individuals to control an area so that the Ukrainians can go to the front. Well, the first thing that the Russians are going to do is target those people you bought. I think he spoke about 2,000, 3,000. At one stage, he was talking about 20,000. But apparently now, people in the know, and I'm not in the know, but people with connections in France say we could only manage about 3,000 to 5,000. Well, those people, as soon as they come across that border, will be targeted by the Russians because they will see them and they'll take them out. So then what do the French do? The French use their force de frappe, the nuclear weapons, to hit back. Tactical guns. What happens? What do you do? This is where it becomes dangerous. Yeah? What happens? So, if you are a Russian and you take out a lot of French people, French soldiers, and then all of a sudden you see French taking off from an airfield, do you say, let's blow the airfield up? Yeah? To stop the French coming forward. Do you say that? Or you see them bringing in tools of warfare. Do you then say, take out these French aircraft? They haven't been doing that up to now, but do you see how that can easily be brought forward? How easily you can fall down that road without even thinking about it. Because, of course, you've got your primary goal, that's to save your people and their lives, not the lives of others. So if it means that, we are taking chieftain tanks and to repair them we send out British soldiers, sheep-dipped, to repair these tanks because they can't be repaired by Ukrainians, do the Ruskies target that area? Do they take these guys out? Right? I don't like that terminology, but I'll use it. So these are all the things where the problems lie, that oftentimes politicians do not think about. Because, ladies and gentlemen, let me explain to you, politicians are not experts in practically anything. I mean, I know I sound like I'm being unfair, but the reality is your average politician doesn't know what he or she is talking about. It doesn't. And we're still, and this is the big one, and it was shown in the Vietnam War, McNamara, who then at the time was the Minister, Secretary of State for Defence. They don't call him Secretary of State, they call him Defence Secretary of the United States. He had already said to, this is how long ago they knew, he had already said to JFK, the war cannot be won. I've done the computations. He came from General Motors. So he was used to doing computations. And he said, listen, we can't win this. But what the president said, JFK, is, I can't stop it now because I'm in an election year and I can't look as though I've lost. I cannot lose. So therefore, I will have to run with Vietnam still going. We won't put more people in, but I'll have to run with Vietnam still going until the election's finished. And then I'll probably take them out. This has come forward. This information has come forward. My argument is this. If it were like previously, and you could even, for the British, push that to the First World War, you could even say that in the First World War, many British ruling class sons found themselves in the army because it was a thing to do, and they got decimated and murdered, not murdered, the soldiers, or killed on the front. Okay, they got killed. We do know that many, frankly, took staff jobs and didn't put themselves in harm's way. But, you know, many did. They were the guys from the public schools. By the way, I did a public school programme 2 weeks ago, so worth listening to. But they were the guys from the public schools who, which in Britain read for that, the highest echelon private schools. So the guys from the public schools who were the ones who would become lords, etc. These guys fought in the war. They went out and fought, you know. Now, you'll be lucky if you see anybody of any stature in the armed forces. Seriously. So because of that, politicians don't have anybody near a war. So it's not a problem for them sending people from Liverpool to die from a Liverpool estate. You know, so we lose a couple of soldiers. They come from Liverpool, from the estate. They took the chance. They might not have made much of their life. The army gave them a good opportunity, and you know, it's taught them some skills, etc., etc. You know, if they were anything, they would have gone to university and worked in the city. Believe me, that's the way many politicians think, particularly on the Tory side. Believe me, that's how they think, right? A little bit different for Labour, because some of them have made their way up from little. But today, not necessarily that many. So today, they've got that same perspective. A perspective of saying, well, you know, you should have done well at school, mate, shouldn't you? And you wouldn't be in the army. Yeah. So this is what happens. And that's the same sort of perspective with police, to be fair. This is what happens. There is a disconnect now from the ruling elite and from the individuals in the state whose role it is to look after the state, to make sure the state functions, to make sure all the rest of the citizens can live within the state. The politicians are looking after the 1% who, because the states are looked after, because the state makes sure that everybody's safe, and that's been done by some person from a lower level echelon as they perceive it, those people live well, but they don't perceive that there's a problem when the others who are doing the naughty bits that allows them to live well, the bits that put them at threat because they're allowed to live well. Now, of course, this might be a little bit different if you find an aircraft or whatever, because that's perceived as good, yeah? So somebody flying an aircraft as a pilot might be the case. But up to now, of course, for the Western armies, those pilots have been at practically zero threat, right? Because we've been fighting people in sandals who are not going to shoot you down as a general rule. You know, so we give them, you know, they've been given surface-to-air shoulder missiles, manpads. Yeah, but as a general rule, you know, those aircraft are not shot down. You know, they get away with it. They've got countermeasures that allow them to get away. And that's why I would say there might be a preponderance of people with some upper echelon aspects to them. But for your regular soldier doing the fighting on the ground, you know, is he really perceived as anything positive? I would suggest no, and I would suggest that they think to themselves, my kids have never been doing this, so why am I really bothered about them? That's the problem we've got. And that is ultra dangerous because it leads politicians to miscalculate. It leads them to utilise the cannon fodder. In the old days, that would be the old colonial soldiers that they use as a cannon fodder for them. Yeah. So they use these guys, and these guys then think, so we'll be all right. But when you do things that go a step further, when you do things that are clearly killing the enemy, when you're not supposed to be in the war itself, then of course the enemy, which you're not supposed to be in a war with, can only perceive you then as a combatant. And it's doubly the case if you involve yourself in terrorism against the enemy, because the enemy then says, okay, you've made that step too far. So that's the dangers where we are, and we've got a bristling of nuclear weapons on the side of the Russians, who, if necessary, and if we think because we can't afford to lose, and when I'm saying we, the United States in principle, you know, I've heard United States senators talking about, let's just use tactical nukes. That's been perceived. Let's just use a tactical nuke to sort out the Russians, okay? Assuming that, of course, it doesn't affect them because they're fighting the war in Ukraine. But you cannot use a tactical nuclear weapon without that affecting you as well. And of course, I would suggest that the Russians would say, well, let's make sure they feel some of the pain. So this now brings us nicely across into what is now the war in the other part of the world that matters, in the Middle East. Because I see exactly the same sort of elements going on there. Now, factually, like it or not, the situation is thus, that miscalculations have been made. The youth of the world are seeing that individuals are being murdered who are not combatants, right? Who are normal, everyday people. And the young are being galvanised to take some action against that by just being in the streets, etc., etc. And that's okay if it's the West, because those people in the streets are being galvanised by that. Yeah, okay, so they make some demonstrations. I mean, it's a little bit worse for people who need to be voted back into power, like Biden does. And there's two aspects that I want you to look at on this with the Biden situation, President Biden situation. President Biden and former President of the United States, you still call him President, but former President Trump are in an existential battle. Whomever loses this election is going to prison. Benjamin Netanyahu feared going to prison so much that he tried to change the judicial system of Israel. In many ways, well, in most ways, Israel is not a democracy. Let's not mess around with that. It's not. Because a great number of individuals within its state or within aspects of its state that it controls have no votes and have no rights. Right? So it would be like saying that South Africa was a democracy. Yes, white people could vote. No doubt about it. You had a right to vote in who you wanted, etc., etc. But that was only the white people. The other 4/5 of the population practically had no rights. So this is where we are with Palestinians and Israelis. Now, the big problem for Israel, as I see it, is as follows. Regardless of what you think of the state of Israel, it is a fact. Now, taking that into account that it is a fact, what you've got to note is that many of the Israelis who happen to be of the Jewish religion, some Zionists, some not, okay, if you say to them, go and visit your grandfather, they need to get onto a plane and to go to another country somewhere else in the world. So the reality is that there isn't necessarily a perspective that says it's all or nothing. Now, that is the case for settlers. About that, there is no doubt. For settlers, they say, this is it, this is where we are. This is where we are. And for some, this is what it is. But for others, they may well, if it gets that bad, say, I've got another passport that allows me to go to Canada, Britain, Poland, less so Poland, Britain, United States, obviously, Russia even, right? I'm off. Because life is no longer good here. Right? It's no longer good here. The Palestinian has nowhere to go. That's where he is from. So therefore, when he visits his granddad, he walks down the road and it's another part of what now is Israel, say. Or what the parts are that are quasi-Palestine, because, as you know, they're not really run by Palestinians, most of the areas. So what I'm saying is, when Netanyahu came out and said, we're going to change the judicial system because politics should be above the judges telling them what to do, and the last vestige of control of a judge should be the politics, many people in the country thought, we want to stop this, so they came out. And there was talk about potential civil war, etc., etc., etc. But they were measuring that against where they might have come from in terms of heritage, rather than what is going to happen if it goes that way. So what you have now is you have two presidents of the United States, one of which, whomever fails, is going into prison, potentially, because they are so bad enemies. Now, you can never say never, and it might be that regardless of who gets in, that one pardons the other. They may do that deal, who knows, I don't know. But as it stands now, they both hate each other, and whomever goes in, and definitely from the Trump side, because he perceives that all his judicial worries are set up by Biden. So if he perceives that, he is then going to put Biden in a whole hell heap of pain should he become the president again. Right? So you've got that. Then you've got Netanyahu, who, you know, he's been on trial a couple of times, but then became the prime minister, so then couldn't be on trial, etc., etc. So therefore, if he loses, he's on trial. Now, this is what I was saying before. The self-interest of politicians is such that what comes first is their well-being. Now, that's what comes first. So the reality is that they've got a vested interest in playing this game out to the very end. So they can't make decisions that say, I might lose this amount of vote, or I might lose this from AIPAC, or I might lose this from wherever. They can't say that. So they're going to have to work through a way of how they can stay in power by allowing victory to be their only really known perspective, at least in the short term. That may lead to poor decision making. Okay? So just the other day example, the attack on the consulate in Damascus, from a basic perspective, may well have been perceived as a good move. You know, they got the top ILG members sitting there, the guys who orientate the battle of the proxies. Now, the proxies are like any other proxy, and I can tell you that Hamas was a proxy of Israel, right? Knowingly or not knowingly. And in terms of, and that sounds crazy, but in terms of the fact that in the past, when Fatah was making ground whereby a two-state solution would have been put in place, and that Jerusalem would have been the capital of that two-state solution, east on west and west on the other, East Jerusalem, West Jerusalem, then, of course, that needed to be scuppered. So the best way to scupper that is to get the enemy fighting itself. So that was done then. Earlier on, the same kind of aspect was utilised by the Abu Nidal group. Now, whether these people knew they were working with the Israeli or not is questionable. But the tactical aspect was to get them doing things that made the rest of the world say, remember the olive branch speech that Yasser Arafat came up with? To stop that, you needed another body that would show how bad the Palestinian was. So Abu Nidal was supported. Now, you could argue, and some Israeli people, this was existential for Israel, because if we didn't have this and we have a two-state solution, bet your bottom dollar somewhere along the line it ends up as a one-state solution, and a one-state solution is the end of the state of Israel, because the birth rate for the Palestinians is going to be way in advance of the birth rate of any Israelis, and the right to return that the Palestinians will demand of all those people in camps who still profess to be Palestinians, be they in Kuwait or in the Lebanon or in Jordan or wherever else. When that opens up, these guys and gals will come back to what is then Palestine, be it half of what it was before, so the 67 route, come back there, and then you will see a burgeoning for it to be a one state that everybody lives together in and we're all happy, come by all. But the reality will be basically the same in Northern Ireland. So it's not something that's crazy. It's exactly the same in Northern Ireland, why the Protestant cannot allow for there to be, or could not allow for there to be a singular running state that allowed everybody with exactly the same rights. It's had to happen because of the killings that had gone on, but they didn't want it. Because they knew the Catholics, because of religious perspective, would outbirth them. And in time to come, like it or not, it will become part of the Republic. Now, the difference is that the British actually weren't that bothered if it becomes part of the Republic, particularly when they're in the European Union. It might be a little bit different now, but particularly when they're in the European Union. And what they know is, and this I'm just jumping there, but it's not off the subject, what they know is that in allowing Northern Ireland to be still part of the European Union sphere, that is more likely sooner than later. And the Protestant knows that. Okay, so that's why they are absolutely against what has happened with the Northern Ireland Agreement and how that's manifested itself in the agreement over Brexit, and where the European Union begins and ends in terms of the movement of goods, etc., and people. This is the same with Israel, frankly. It's exactly the same. Because at some stage, this will out. Because what's happening is, as I said to you, and the reason why I said it before, the people who came from outside of Israel and who came to Israel from the West, etc., bring with them Western perspectives of living. I've been there 101 times. Western perspectives of living, which denates in many ways, not always, but in many ways, that they have a whole load of children, right? So the birth rate, because you can't look as an Israeli and think 4 years down the line. You've got to think 20 years down the line, okay? So this is where the problem is. So Netanyahu, and now there is one set of people, of course, who have loads of children to get past this, and that's the ultra-Orthodox. But the problem is, and this is the crazy thing, the ultra-Orthodox will not fight in wars. The ultra-Orthodox won't even use Hebrew because they're going to turn around and say that this is not the language that should be used in normal parlance. It's the language that can only be used when talking to God. So therefore, what you've got is a body of people who would have the numbers that might aid you, but they're not the body of people that's going to help you in terms of running the nation. Definitely not defending it. Right? So that's where you have your problem. So, it's a mess, frankly. It's a mess. So this is where the problem lies. So Netanyahu, I'm guessing, figures to himself, right, what we do then is we take out all our enemies, and in taking out our enemies and in deluding the areas of Palestinians, we can then start again. We can then occupy the occupied territories, which comes later, but we can take over Gaza and take that because Gaza is running its own little area that we made sure they did. Yeah, and it's Hamas. And we can say these people in Hamas are terrorists because, they're like the ultra-Orthodox, little give, as it's perceived in the rest of the world. Same for the Orthodox, little give, as it's perceived in the rest of the world. It's not true with either party, but that's how it's perceived. Right? So therefore we can utilise that. And we can utilise that to make sure that we can get rid of these folk and give us another 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, whatever it might be, before we have to come back to this same situation. And if we can, let's do it on the West Bank as well. The problem is, and this is the thing, the young around the world are not accepting that. They're saying that's not right. How can that happen? How can all these people be killed and nobody's saying anything? This cannot be right. So they are forcing the West to rethink. Now, but as I said to you earlier on, that's not the biggest problem. The much bigger problem, the much, much, much bigger problem is states in the Middle East who have done business with the Israelis and frankly are happy to do business with the Israelis, see no sense in dying on behalf of Palestinians, frankly. Right? Let's be truthful about it. Frankly, see no sense in dying on behalf of a foreign people. Right? The people say to them, you're going to have to do something. So you saw there was a great deal of rhetoric from Erdogan, right? He had a great deal of rhetoric about what should be done. But the problem with him having that rhetoric with the election coming up is he brought his people to the top of the hill. And his people are demanding that you do something because you brought it to their attention. So we're now demanding that you take some action. So if Israelis go too far, demands will come from the Turkish people that something is done about the Israelis. Right? This is where the problem lies. Lebanon don't want to find himself in a war. The politicians definitely. Even to be fair, Hezbollah doesn't necessarily wish to find itself in a war. But the people are demanding it because you said this is our raison d'etre. This is why we're here. So the people are demanding it. The Iranians forever and a day have demanded that we do something. We do something about this. So why would you not? So when the miscalculation is made to blow up these guys who run the proxies, because they're all together in one, what wasn't taken account of is what the demand would be from the people of Iran, not from the politicians who would try to have appeased the situation if they could. Because, look, they don't want to be in a war, they don't want to have their countries wrecked, because you're going to end up like in the Ukraine at the end of the day when the war's finished and we're all wrecked. Right? But no, the people demand, and this is where the problems lie. The same with Egypt. Again, the people are demanding that some action is taken. The last thing they want to do is open up Rafah and let in a whole load of Palestinians into Egypt because he'd never get rid of them. And of course, he also knows that is the plan of Netanyahu: delude them by pushing them into Sinai and then leaving them there. Then it's up to the Egyptians what they do, right? That'll be an Egyptian problem to deal with, not an Israeli problem. So what the Egyptians want to do is get as much food in there as they can to say they're keeping them, because they know the plan is ethnic cleansing. Right? They know that's the plan. Because that's what the right-wing Israelis are saying. Now, the left-wing Israelis, and this is the point, people put people all together, are saying something completely different. But, of course, they've been hardened to the situation by the events of the 15th, which have been played up. And by that, what I mean is there's now been very little evidence to suggest that many of the atrocities which were stated actually happened. That's now become factual. That's information's now become factual. So the left is saying, well, hang on, and I'm getting this from Haaretz and left-leaning Israeli papers, are saying, what do we do? What do we do? You know, they're in a quandary. We don't like Netanyahu, but we can't have this happen to us because they can see they'll be chased out of the game. But because it's been played incorrectly, what may well happen is that there's war on all fronts. Now, the only way around it that I think that Netanyahu thinks he can see is to drag the United States into conflict. And that the United States will do the killing for him. So if he brings Iran in, and there's a whole load of neocons who want to fight the Iranians and have wanted to fight them for 25 years, yeah, that these, your Senator Graham's, etc., these people will then say, we need to give the Iranians a bloody nose and teach them a lesson. I shouldn't be doing the American, but I'm doing it. Teach them a lesson that they shouldn't be doing this. And aid the state of Israel. Right? That's what they'll be saying. Right? Loud and clear. And Netanyahu then thinks that's the way out. Because with the United States, then they have the capacity to win a war. But I suggest, and this is the point I'm going to make, I suggest it will be a Pyrrhic victory. A victory at too high a price. Because we can now see from the operation carried out by the Iranians the other day, is that what they have the capacity to do is overwhelm defensive systems of Israel. Ipso facto, which means the most defensive systems in the world at some of the places that they attacked. Now, what has that done? This is where it gets worse. It's made everybody fearful. Because now everybody's saying, hang on, the Israelis had the best equipment going that you could get, tied to the US system as well, to that NORAD system that the US use, yeah? Have got all the interceptors from the US and modified some of the interceptors. And what happens? The Iranians sent over, frankly, a load of, if you're in Germany, you say gebastelte, or made up bloody drones, who went forward and actually caused our weapons system, billion-dollar weapons system, to fire off a whole host of weapons. And then they were able to get the old kit through to land on site. We're not talking new kit. We're talking old weaponry, old ballistic weapons that they've utilised to get through. So the targeting of that means that now we can clearly see, and I mean clearly see, that if all-out war actually happens between Iran and Israel, without the United States, Israel will struggle, absolutely struggle. And if all-out war happens, it won't just be Iran. It'll also be Hezbollah coming from the north, and it'll be, I suggest, Hamas isn't great, but Hamas coming in from central to south. So you'll have a warfare that is not stoppable. So what then happens? Samsung option, which is basically to use the nuclear weapons that Israel has in demeanour. Now, I question this again because earlier on I mentioned South Africa and it getting rid of its nuclear weapons. But what I learnt back then when I was on the South African section, that the South African nuclear weapons were actually quite, basic would be a wrong word, but easy to develop. And I think that it wouldn't be difficult if the option is already in the mind now of the Iranian since this last strike on them, this retaliatory strike on the Iranian now, that they don't think, let's create a South African type nuclear weapon. Still does the job, still blows up as a nuclear weapon. And I heard somebody suggesting the other day, somebody whom I respect because of their knowledge, that would only take 2-3 weeks. Because the point is this, as a general rule, what has been the problem with nuclear weapon usage, which basically North Korea understood, was that, frankly, it's the capacity to carry the weapon. Well, the Iranians have already shown they have that capacity. Even in their old kit, they have that capacity. Even their old kit had the capacity to drop off 12 different bomblets and to suggest to the Patriot system, the Iron Dome that the Israelis have, basically the Patriot system, that 9 attacks are coming at you, right? Now you can do that with nuclear warhead and you're there. And that's not taking into account, if it comes all out and people are looking at things from that perspective, because you never know who's going to jump in, would you then get, example, I don't know, Pakistanis saying, we're going to aid Iran? Would you get the Turks saying, we'll aid them with some assistance, not with nuclear, but with some assistance, because they don't have it, but with some assistance? Would you get the Russians saying, well, if the Americans are aiding them, we'll aid the Iranians, who, by the way, now, this is where it's all coming together, folks, who, by the way, now are part of BRICS. And maybe that's required. You know, again, what would the Chinese say? I don't think they'd militarily interest themselves in it, but I think they would interest themselves in the issue with materiel and with the potential for economic assistance in some way, shape or means. Because the world's splitting into two camps. So this is what I'm saying, and this is what this whole critical thinking has been about. The return to the Cold War. But the worst thing about it is, it has nothing to do with two different ideologies. You see, under the old system, when it had to do with ideologies, there was an ideological perspective, and you could say I was on one side or the other, and I thought to myself, yeah, I believe in this or I believe in this. This is not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is the worst of all worlds. And that worst of all worlds is nations saying, this is what we need to do to support our nation. Forget ideological perspective, it's nations. You know, the sort of thing that leads you into the First World War, whereby you make a mistake and you run on a timetable because you need the timetable to function, because you need the trains to work for you. So a nation thinking about how you work, and the other nations following the other nation because they want to assist the other nation, because otherwise they're outplayed and they may be caught out. This is the problem where we are now today. It's one of the things that we should have got away from, 20 years ago. But we'll fall straight back into it. A guy once said, a fellow by the name of Scott Ritter, interesting fella, who basically was a UN inspector, was part of the Marine Intelligence Corps, etc. He once said, and I know exactly what he was saying because I remember at the time I was in West Germany and I took an interest in this stuff, and I was aware of the bristling of the NATO double system, double agreement, double Beschluss, etc., where weapons are on, short-range nuclear weapons were there. And he said there was a time when every night you went to bed, if you knew what you were talking about, you feared the fact that you wouldn't wake up in the morning. We are now back to that. We're back to hair-trigger responses that suggest, what should I do? That politicians have to think, what should I do? The military has to think, what should I do? This is coming at us. Is this nuclear tipped? Is it normal? What's the score? This is what now these guys have got to think. The Iranians have got to think that. Example. So do we fire off all what we've got before Israel comes back with this ammunition auction? Do the Israelis see something coming across and think, we got to fire our stuff off, otherwise we're done? Have they now gone the South African way and created a nuclear capacity? This is dangerous. In spin across the other part of the world, is the Ukraine now going to do something ultra stupid and carry out extreme terror throughout the whole of Russia with the assistance of the West, which the East Russia can then not look away from? Is somebody like Macron going to do a stupid thing and send 10,000 soldiers, 5,000 soldiers, 3,000 soldiers, get them killed, and then think, bloody hell, I've got to use a Foster Frapp in order to re-establish myself? This is the thing. Does somebody else take over in Russia? I don't think so. I think Putin's secure. But somebody else take over in Russia, because if somebody does, it isn't going to be somebody less aggressive. Indeed, it's going to be somebody more aggressive. And do they say, let's take them out before they take us out? This is where we are. We are a very, very dangerous place. Does the United States say we're going to lose number one, so who cares? Let's just sort it all out before we lose number one. There's senators in the United States. You've got Mitt Romney, saw the other day. This is a fellow who ran for the presidency of the United States. He turned around and said, the best billions we've ever spent, we've killed loads of Russian soldiers. Right? Best money we've ever spent. We've killed hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers, he said. I don't know whether that's a true figure, but hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers, and it only cost us, I think he said 100 billion. And we didn't lose a single American, right? Now, if this is some backward guy saying this who doesn't really matter, but this is a guy who's running for the President of the United States and nearly got it, was up there, right? So if you're a state listening to that, you say there's absolute hatred against us, maybe we need to hit them before they hit us. Maybe we send, maybe we send all of our tactical options out there. Right? So isometric warfare. It doesn't have to be open. It doesn't have to be open at all. Maybe we stop every traffic light from working in the United States. Maybe we stop all of the heating systems or cooling systems on a nuclear power station. Maybe we do that. Because the redundancy isn't there in their systems. Because we know that in the West in particular, they've worked on old systems. The base knowledge for the tech is old. The knowledge on top is new, but it was argued some time ago that it costs too much to deal with the base tech. Right? Maybe we say, okay, let's incite absolute revolution in the United States. Let's go out and about and let's make sure that they all fight each other. Because they're trying to overthrow us, so let us try and overthrow them. Let's actually work on the perspective that race is a massive definer in the United States. And let's have one race against another. Yeah, and you can split that up to 10 different races if you want in the United States. Let's have genders against each other. And let's make that the thing that will cause the rupture, that will cause some sort of evolution. All options are there. Doesn't need to be one way of doing it. If you perceive that your enemy is doing things to you, maybe you say, let's do things to the enemy. Let's say to the British public, you know what? What's happened to your country? You don't even run it anymore. You've got a whole load of foreigners running it. And the problem is, when you have a Prime Minister who stands up because George Galloway has won an election and talks about foreigners doing things, does he not see himself that others can say, yeah, you're that foreigner? And you're the reason why we may think that we need to take some action to get rid of you. Right? This is the problem with a modern day politician, not thinking things through and going to the most base aspect of individuals, the most base aspect of them, right? Taking that cap off the bottle to win an election, knowing, and I believe they do, that they can't put it back on again, but at least I've won the election for me. So you go the base element to it. And that base element plays into people who may want to do you harm because you are doing them harm. As I say, I hope to God we're not involved ourselves in terror within the state of Russia. So this is what I'm saying. It's an ultra dangerous time that, unlike in the past, in the wars that I've been involved in, you've been flying out there, may come and hit you in your own land. The Cold War was enough of that being tried to be done in the Cold War. All the time the other enemy was trying to feed negativity, paying for the miners to be involved in the miners' strike, paying for the left to fight against the right, paying for the left to undermine the situation of the right paying for the right, actually, to undermine the system. Yeah? This whole thing was going on. The problem is our middle classes never see it, so think there was never any danger. But that was going on all the time, paying for people to be at each other's throats. Right? So it isn't a given that we don't ever feel anything, even if it's not out and out activity, but it's asymmetric warfare. So, ladies and gentlemen, I leave you with that. Unfortunately, it's probably not the best scenario that you want to go to bed with. But I hope, because we're trying to do something for geopolitics, we're trying to be fair, we're trying not to play any blame games, we're trying to see all angles, because that's what it's about, that you consider where we are and that you think about what might happen. And maybe that, orientates how you vote. I don't know. It's up to you. I wouldn't profess to try and tell you which way to run on that. But I would say, be aware of the world in which you live in. And don't necessarily take the first thing you hear or the first thing you've been taught as gospel. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'll see you again next week. Until then.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe for free.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
More than a quarter of a century, I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.